Hello, Fort Smith. Did you know that we're the 32nd worst cycling city in the country? How did it get that way? Let's find out. People for Bikes is a nonprofit organization with the goal of helping people in cities realize the positive impacts of cycling on people's health, community connections, economies, American identity, and pollution. They've been around since 1999, and in that time they've given more than 400 financial grants to local governments and nonprofits totaling more than $3.5 million. That includes a grant to our neighbors to the north in Bentonville, the Ozark Foundation. And any visitor to their website can type in the name of their city and see just where they rank. That 5 is our score out of 100, and that 1701 in blue is our rank out of 1,733. Their criteria for this whole ranking are 6 categories. 1. Safe speed limits for automobiles. 2. Protected bike lanes. 3. Safe intersections. 4. Network connections, mean you can actually cycle somewhere useful. 5. Stress level when cycling. There's a 6th category called reallocated space, which I don't quite understand, but it sounds like some sort of combination of protected bike lanes and safe intersections. So I wanted to judge Fort Smith for myself on these 6 criteria. I'm going to be as fair as possible and take the best routes available while still being able to maximize my distance traveled. On the first cool day of our so far very hot 2023, I drove Big Red from the Chaffee Farmers Market to the Fort Smith Farmers Market. I took the best and safest route I could find, and along the way I made sure to point out the good and the bad of cycling in Fort Smith. Is People for Bikes being fair to Fort Smith? Let's speed things up and find out. Here in Chaffee are narrow and poorly maintained streets. When streets are kept narrow like this, it gives a traffic calming effect which makes it safer for pedestrians and cyclists. My one improvement I can imagine here is perhaps some trees and some additional maintenance on the roads. But the way it is now is a great example of something called the risk compensation principle, which basically means that locations that look dangerous or unfamiliar encourage drivers to drive more safely. You'll notice that people feel safe pushing strollers and walking their dogs right in the street. We have a variety of modes of transit in use all at once, and overall safety here feels great. Chaffee Crossing will be a great place to live someday if you're the type of person who wants to be able to shop for groceries, go to church, and have dinner at a restaurant all within a few minutes walk from your home. I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of cycling in Chaffee. But if this ride were just an ordinary morning commute with me on my bicycle competing for my safety against pickup trucks, not a casual stroll on one of the busiest days of the year, I could definitely find a room for improvement for cycling. Maybe all it would take is to pedestrianize Buckhorn Street. That's something I can honestly see happening someday. So I think there's a lot of potential here. As we come up on Roberts Boulevard, you'll notice that this is probably where a cyclist will start feeling some stress. If you're not a cyclist, you might think we love blocking traffic on busy roads, but in most cases, it's a necessity from a lack of infrastructure. It only seems more common than it is because you aren't able to see me when I'm using routes that take me away from traffic. Slowing you down or making you swerve around me is a source of stress for me that makes me more likely to drive my automobile. I was lucky on this particular ride to have just one car behind me, but you could hopefully see from the traffic coming from the other direction that traffic here moves fast and it doesn't feel very safe to ride here until we get to the I-49 overpass. Roberts Boulevard continues past the dog food factory here and then connects into our excellent trail system. The trail system and the parks that it connects with are really the gem in the Fort Smith cycling crown. For those of you who haven't ridden it before, my route today really only shows off a small percentage of it, but I really recommend renting one of those Rides for Smileys electric bikes and getting lost in some of these trails. And if you're not afraid of unpaved trails, take those too, but you should probably only ride an acoustic bike on soft trails. E-bikes have a tendency to tear up the path. We're so isolated on some of these trails that this woman had her dog out for a walk without expecting any other traffic. But yeah, the Fort Smith network of trails are well maintained, completely isolated from traffic, and put you in the middle of nature. And this is the first important difference between recreational and commuter cyclists. This trail is fantastic, but it's suited almost entirely for recreation. It doesn't go many useful places unless you work at ArcBest and can afford a home in this wealthier part of town. Otherwise, you're driving from one person's house to another. So this is called the network effect. What this means is that the value and usefulness of the trail goes up as you connect it to more places. Each mile of trail has more beneficial impact than the last, but right now we don't really have that network. This is the intersection of Zero Street and Mazard. There are safer ways to cross Zero to the east, but once you cross over there, you're immediately confronted by Rogers Avenue, which is absolutely impossible to navigate without an auto. At this intersection, the first thing you'll notice is that there's a right turn only lane here, which this pickup doesn't realize as he blows through his red light and goes forward. Right turn only lanes are extremely dangerous for cyclists and pedestrians because the drivers in them are usually looking to their left to make sure they can take a legal right turn on red. So in order to cross here as a cyclist, I have to pass in front of cars who are not accustomed to checking for cyclists in my direction. Zero is also a high-speed, industrial road without any traffic calming measures. Its wide lanes create a built environment that induces high-speed traffic. And as we get to the other side, I wanted to point out a piece of infrastructure that wasn't put here by the city planner. It cost the city nothing to install, and yet it's extremely important for informing us of how people move in our city. This small red in the ground is called a desire path, and what it shows is a more efficient path for pedestrians than what our city planners could come up with. In this case, and in many others, it exists because there's no sidewalk here, but it serves as proof that pedestrian infrastructure is needed here. And since it's caused by people taking a shortcut, we can safely wager that it's efficient. So if we're to replace a desire path with anything besides pedestrian infrastructure, it follows that we would be sacrificing walkability. This is a stretch of protected cycle lane next to Mazard. This is the only section of the city that I can safely call a bike highway, and it's so appreciated. Notice that this stretch of highway is mostly kept parallel to the road. It doesn't have to be that way. There are sidewalks and cycle paths in our city that twist and turn around obstacles, while cars get to continue moving in a straight line unimpeded. Giving all modes of transit equal priority is called complete streets. Complete streets doesn't mean Fort Smith needs a subway and a cable car. It just means pedestrians, cyclists, and our existing bus system are kept in mind when planning new routes. The other concept illustrated by Mazard and Phoenix is the difference between a road and a street. A road is a higher capacity car traffic route with the purpose of getting people from A to B. A street, on the other hand, is an end destination. It's where the traffic disperses in several directions when it's finished traversing the road. When you combine a street and a road into the same place, Charles Marone calls it a strode, and it's the reason Rogers Avenue got so bad and what's happening to Phoenix right now. The solution to preventing traffic like Rogers Avenue is to keep your thoroughfares separate from your housing and commercial real estate. I also won't be driving on any really strody places in this video because they're almost impossible for cyclists to ride on. This construction taking over the sidewalk while the street is kept at full capacity can be frustrating as a cyclist. It also makes me more likely to take an automobile the next time I need to travel to businesses on Phoenix. But construction is temporary, and in this city I feel fortunate that there's any sidewalk here at all. The south side of Phoenix has a sidewalk the whole way of our trip and is much less strody than the north side. One characteristic of a strode is there are a bunch of driveways in and out of businesses, which are incredibly dangerous for cyclists. Like our example of the right turn lanes on Zero, the cars coming out of these driveways are often looking to their left so they can turn right, and aren't able to see a bicycle riding against traffic. So it can be incredibly dangerous to ride a bike on the sidewalk, and especially if it's against traffic. But the only other option here on Phoenix is to ride on the road. The sidewalk on the north side ends. Phoenix is technically a cycle route. There are signs that say share the road or something with a picture of a bicycle, but I think that would be asking for certain death. So I stick to the unsafe sidewalk where it's actually illegal to ride in many cities. From the point we crossed Zero to now, we've cycled about 3.8 miles. But as the crow flies, it's only been about 2.2 miles. This is because of the massive airport to our left, which is simultaneously shielding us from car traffic, which is great, but is also a barrier between the Rogers Avenue corridor and the southeast side of town. If dreams could come true, I would wish for a pedestrian or cyclist route through the airport. I realize with the vast number of foreign militaries trading at this airport that it could never happen, and I wouldn't sacrifice their very important presence for my own personal comfort. Another option to get cycles around the airport would be to improve the cyclability of 45, south of Zero Street. I could see that happening someday, since Garin Road has had an excellent new trail built within the last year. This intersection has a new feature we haven't seen yet on this trip. Old Greenwood has a slip lane for people turning right here. Slip lanes are similar to and often studied alongside right turn only lanes like we encountered crossing Zero, but instead of asking autos to come to a complete stop, a slip lane encourages autos to negotiate a right-hand turn at a higher velocity, which discourages them from checking for a clear roadway to their right. They also have less peripheral vision due to their higher velocity. So slip lanes have shown, in at least one study, to increase pedestrian accidents by 70 to 80% over a normal intersection. Old Greenwood is one of the best parts of this ride, and I don't have much to say other than how beautiful this stretch of road is. So, since it's a longer stretch of road without much else to say, this might be a good time to introduce induced demand. It's a complicated topic, so an in-depth explanation is best left for a future video, but induced demand is a very important topic, and it's why I'm almost always opposed to building new roads. Induced demand is a concept borrowed from economics where, when you lower the cost of a good or service, the increased availability of that product attracts new customers to try your product. Which sounds obvious, but let's illustrate things anyway. For example, if you own a food truck, part of the cost of that sandwich is the price of having to wait in line. So if people are only willing to wait in line 6 people deep, there's an unmeasurable segment of the population who might be interested in your food, but not willing to wait in that long of a line for it. But if you lower the cost of waiting by installing a second window on your food truck and have double your number of lines to 2, the wait time for a sandwich gets shorter for 3 of your original customers. But now you've also doubled the number of people you're serving lunch to. And this same concept applies to roads. If you can just imagine these sandwich customers are drivers, and the new service window is an extra lane of traffic. And that's why freeway expansions and new roads usually don't offer much relief to traffic congestion. But aha, you say, I just fell for your trap. Aren't there twice as many people getting sandwiches now? Aren't we putting twice as much money into the economy? Aren't we making twice as many people happy? Well, no, not really. There are other hidden costs to increased volume that we didn't know about before getting rid of this waiting in line bottleneck of our food truck. Maybe there's a mustard machine on the front of the truck that had no trouble accommodating one customer at a time, but when we double our volume, now there's a second line forming for the mustard machine. Oh, and there's also a toaster in the truck that can't keep up with twice as many customers either, so the total time spent waiting in line actually has gone up now. Oh, and the generator behind the truck runs out of fuel twice as quickly now, so we actually have to close the shop earlier than we did before. I hope you can see where I'm going with this. Each time we get rid of a bottleneck in our sandwich flow, we learn about another bottleneck, maybe 2. These bottlenecks, we didn't realize it, but they've been here all along. It was just getting rid of that initial bottleneck that brought them to us. So the same is with traffic. Spending money to increase volume doesn't necessarily equate to an increase in time savings for drivers. And there are some real-world examples of a mustard bottleneck or toaster bottleneck for roads too. But we'll have to discuss it in another video. So I don't have plans to do a more in-depth induced demand video in the short term. It would probably be a year or more. So if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, there's a lot of great content on induced demand already on YouTube. In terms of what would be most relevant to Fort Smith, I recommend the excellent video by Strong Towns about the battle against traffic. Attention passengers, we are approaching our destination and ask that you please return to your seats for final grading. Let's bring up that rubric. Very nice. Now, how did Fort Smith do? Is People for Bikes onto something or way off base here? The first category is safe speed limits, and I have to say, even though we were separate from traffic, the most of our time was spent traveling on Phoenix and Old Greenwood. Phoenix was a nightmare, and a tiny fender bender between two cars could have seriously put our life at risk. But Old Greenwood felt great, as did a few other places like Chaffee and B Street. In terms of protected bike lanes, Fort Smith does have a few of them, but even if I'm being generous in counting the sidewalks, I didn't really feel protected from the entire latter 3/5 of my trip. It was only the bike highway section along Mazard that I found particularly useful. But believe me, I'm grateful for what we have and truly appreciate the hard work it took to get it built. Well done, Fort Smith. That cycle lane, and I think there's another one on Jenny Lind by the way, is a huge improvement over our normal sidewalks, and much more than other cities could ever dream of achieving. One thing I didn't mention is that this ride would be completely different if I were an early morning commuter who, like many people, has to ride their bike in the dark. I might score this differently if we took this ride at night. For safe intersections, there's no way to be nice about this. I could have talked about the Zero Street intersection for an hour or longer, just nitpicking the many design choices that I disagree with. I don't think Zero was ever anticipated to cross any version of Mazard with that much traffic on it. But I do think we could drastically improve things at that intersection and many others in Fort Smith. We just have a culture that's afraid of change and mild inconvenience, so I'm not holding my breath. For network connections, this is another easy one. We don't have any network at all. You have to own a car to participate in our economy in any meaningful way. If and when Chaffee really takes off, I can see our network connection improving. For stress levels, this is a harder one to grade. I experienced stress on Roberts Boulevard, crossing Zero Street, crossing driveways on Phoenix, crossing streets and businesses on Greenwood, and crossing Rogers. But other than the crossings at Zero and Phoenix, each one of these was only a light stressor, but it was stress nonetheless. I think instead of grading my own ride here, it might help me to ask non-cyclists why they don't ride to work. And I would guess that a lot of you don't ride to work because of stress. Finally is reallocated space. I don't really have an idea of what this means or how to apply it to my specific route today. But if I could grade Fort Smith more generally, I know that there's a lot of good being done by our local government in converting existing space with mobility-focused enhancements. The Acme Brickyard was recently purchased, and I'm not sure what the plans are there, but it's something related to cycling, I think. Fort Smith also hired a full-time mobility coordinator at City Hall, and he's doing a good job of inspiring community involvement in mobility-related topics. And even where cycling isn't concerned, I know some of our directors are trying to help Fort Smith capture the so-called missing middle housing and have nurtured and supported risky infill developments in this city. I've also heard firsthand from one of our directors, with some agreement from his colleagues, that we need to build a lot more trails. These are all not examples of things that are directly related to our ride, but they do help cut down on traffic and make cycling more comfortable. So as bad as those other categories have been, I'm extremely proud of how our existing space has been used for mobility, and I'm optimistic of future projects diverging away from the so-called arrogance of space. So that's my view at least. I wouldn't say Fort Smith is a good cycling city. In fact, I'd say we were a very bad, even a horrible cycling city. But 32nd worst in the country, People for Bikes is a little off base here. Or am I being the one off base? What are your experiences as a cyclist in Fort Smith? Please let me know in the comments, and don't be afraid to let me know what you think I've got wrong. And if you're not from Fort Smith, I'd love to hear where you live and what you think of my experience today, and how would you compare it to your own city's cycling infrastructure? Stay tuned here for more cycling and mobility-related content in Fort Smith. Signing off now. Bye, audience!